The year of 1027 was a huge question mark in Georgian history. The energetic warrior king, George I, was dead. His firstborn son and chosen successor would come to rule at an early age, just like George. Again, the young kingdom of Georgia was under the thumb of an adolescent. The nobles and regents resorted back to their greed and abuse of the crown. Repetition of the past appeared all but assured. And it nearly was, if not for King Bagrat IV. In his eventful 45 years of reign, he re-established the power of the Georgian crown, even if this was simply achieved by outliving his opponents. Bagrat IV was born in 1018, the first in his line set to inherit the Kingdom of Georgia at his birth. His mother was named Miriam, an Armenian princess from Vasparukin. When Bagrat was only 3, his little world would be flipped upside down. First, his maternal grandfather, the king of Vasparukin, would sell his country to the Byzantines, thereby forcing King George to find a new marriage partner and ally. He divorced Miriam of Vasparukin, sending her away from her own children, including Bagrat. Not long after, Emperor Basil the Bulgar Slayer put an end to the Byzantine-Georgian War. The subsequent treaty would see Bagrat become a royal hostage in Constantinople. Here, Bagrat would remain until the age of 6, when in 1025 Rome's longest reigning emperor would die. With him gone, Georgia's future longest reigning monarch would be released from his captivity, but not without trouble. Once Basil's successor, Emperor Constantine VIII, wrangled the purple cloth, he requested King George to send his son back. He declined, and a race began. Constantine chased down the Georgian prince but could not capture his caretakers until they were beyond the border. There was no way King George would give back his son. After Basil had quelled the Georgians, Constantine immediately reignited the rivalry. Only 2 years later, King George mysteriously died at the age of 25. With foul play a likely culprit, the Byzantines and nobles had both gotten exactly what they wanted. A child king ruled in Georgia once again. If you thought King George had troubles with his nobility, what Bagrat would have to face over his long reign became a whole different kind of beast to slay. The 11-year Regency Council of Bagrat would be entrusted to a trio of influential figures. First and foremost, there was his mother, Miriam of Vasparukin. After King George's death, she rejoined the court and was finally reunited with her son. It was her alone that could protect Bagrat from the corrupted nobility. The other 2 regents were, of course, 2 prominent Georgian nobles, thereby always guaranteeing a majority rule in stately matters. Duke Liptart IV of Clydkerry was the greatest Georgian general of his time. In fact, his father had given his own life to save Bagrat's father from the clutches of Emperor Basil, leaving no man more fit to defend the young king from foreign powers. In contrast, Duke Ivan of Kartli was one of the wealthiest men in Georgia. He represented the voice of the corrupted nobility, as well as a source of funds for the campaigns of the regency. The power of the regents would immediately be tested by the Byzantine Empire. Constantine VIII still wanted his Georgian hostage, and now there was no King George in the way to stop him. He had found a new candidate for the throne of Georgia, someone more accepting of Byzantine rule. The constant Bagrationi family civil wars had finally been settled under King Bagrat the Unifier, but he didn't eliminate the other branches to their entirety. Prince Dmitri, the son of a man who revolted against Bagrat the Unifier, now returned to Georgia, a Byzantine army behind him. The longtime Constantinople resident Dmitri Bagrationi likely met King Bagrat during his short stay there as a hostage. Dmitri razed western Georgia, besieging and taking the impregnable Artunaji castle. Surrounding dukes started to give their bid to Byzantium and their adult, Bagratid candidate. As the lords defected, the armies snowballed until reaching Klidkari, the home of Duke Liptaret, the warrior regent of King Bagrat. The Byzantines and traitors besieged his castle, but were sufficiently repulsed until making their retreat. Duke Liptaret and Ivan then made a decisive counterattack, battling the Byzantines back to their own border, in the process capturing Dmitry Bagrationi and imprisoning him for the rest of his life. After Dmitry's capture, Dowager Queen Mariam left Kutaisi for Constantinople, seeking a peace treaty to end these more than usual hostilities. Arrangements were made, with the young Bagrat receiving the ever-important title of Kouropalates. With promises of continued coexistence, a marriage alliance was struck between the 14-year-old Bagrat and the current emperor, Romanus III Argiosa's niece, Helena. The regency had overcome their most dangerous obstacle, and gained a powerful ally in the process. King Bagrat was safe, and another claimant to his throne had been eliminated. With authority restored, the dual dukes of the regency looked to the offensive. They set their sights on the ancient capital turned Muslim stronghold, the city of Tbilisi. The emir of Tbilisi was caught unaware and retreated to the fort Abirtvisi. The dukes besieged and took the stronghold canyon citadel, shackling the emir in chains. They promised to release him, on the condition that he remain a Georgian vassal. Duke Liptaret also took personal control over the castle Abirtvisi. Pressing farther east, there is still the Kartvelian kingdom of Kakheti Hereti, which had been ruled under the steady hand of Kivrke the Great for nearly 30 years. His successor and adopted son, King Gagik, was of Bagratid heritage. His father was King David of Lori, an Armenian Bagratuni by birth, while his mother was the daughter of King Kivrke the Great. The regents took this inheritance as their own. It was easy to connect and justify the reign of the senior lineage of Bagrat. In 1029, the regents invaded their Kartvelian neighbor. Newly crowned King Gagik retreated from Kakheti, giving it up for the much more defendable Hereti. In the year of 1033, the 16-year-old Bagrat would face a great tragedy. His wife and niece of the Byzantine emperor would die without bearing a child. Soon thereafter, Bagrat would marry the daughter of King Durjalol the Great of Alania. Her name was Borina. With their dynasties no longer connected, the emperor made his move to take Georgia with a far more suitable candidate, Bagrat's younger half-brother. Demetrius was born a few years after Bagrat. His mother, Auda, was also a princess of Alania, turning this Georgian civil war into a micro-Alanian civil war as well. In 1033, Auda of Alania, speaker of the king's second son, defected to Byzantium, taking the seaside fortress of Anacopia along with them. Two adolescent brother kings were now being puppeteered to fight one another, but there was a fresher threat on the other side of the kingdom. With the absence of a powerful Arabian or Persian empire, the many local ethnic groups of the Caucasus, Zagros, and Taurus Mountains were free to choose their own destiny, and many chose to raid their next-door neighbor. In a somewhat rare scene, the Kurdish people had their own Kurdistan. Under the Shaddadid dynasty, Armenia shrunk from outside invasion and civil war, and the Kurds directly profited and grew from their rivals' fall from power. In 1034, a group of Kurds from Aran, even went as far as to raid deep into eastern and northern Georgia. Both Bagratid branches of Armenia and Georgia were stirred to action, seeking to end their mutual threat together. The increasingly powerful Kurdish dynasty ruling over Aran and the surrounding East Caucasus defeated the combined Christian army. This battle symbolized the end of 200 years of Bagratid hegemony over the whole of the West and Central Caucasus. It would be another half-century before one of these families' full resurgence. While the Kurds were rising, the Georgians with Byzantine meddling were still fighting amongst themselves. The brother kings were at nothing more than a stalemate, Demetrius having unwavering control over Anacopia, but not much else. Not wanting to add fuel to another Georgian-Byzantine war, the regents looked east yet again. With Aran not far from Tbilisi, it was now or never for the Kartvelians to reclaim their lost capital. Duke Liptaret gathered a host and dove into the emirate. As expected, their army retreated into their highly defendable city. The siege lasted for a year and was nearly complete in 1038. And that's when, in Duke Liptaret's eyes, he was betrayed by his own king. In that year, the now 20-year-old King Bagrat finally came of age. With the nobles whispering in his ear about Duke Liptaret's growing power, one of the king's first actions was to make peace with the emirate of Tbilisi. Duke Liptaret was forced to end his siege by the young king he had fought so hard to protect. He would never forgive him. His regency ended and the duke returned to his more than numerous lands in the east. After discarding one regent, the other decided to decisively act. Duke Ivan Abazadze was not as willing to let go of the reins of power as Liptaret was. He was always slightly jealous of Duke Liptaret, who seemed to be the senior member of the regency trio. He was happy to see him go, but not looking forward to what came next. While Bagrat was struggling to break out of his youth, Ivan had much more devious plans. If Bagrat would no longer let him rule Georgia, then Bagrat was no longer useful alive. Duke Ivan of Kartli, along with his 4 younger brothers, started orchestrating a plot to assassinate their newly ruling king. Somehow their plans slipped, and Bagrat, upon learning, had Duke Ivan and his siblings arrested. They would all live out the rest of their days in the dungeons, a far cry from their more than privileged upbringing. Although Liptaret hadn't betrayed King Bagrat outright, he was no longer a common fixture in the Georgian court, meaning that the only regent to stay by the side of Bagrat was his own mother. She would continue to be an influential figure in the realm until her death. Having been disgraced, Duke Liptaret decided to offer his services to a Bagrationi who could not refuse them. In 1039, he joined the opposite side of the Georgian Civil War, supporting the Byzantine-aligned brother of Bagrat, Demetrius of Anacopia. With Byzantium in the west and Liptaret in the east, Georgia would surely fold into itself. Not only this, but the king of Hereti, Gagik Bagratuni, allied himself to Duke Liptaret and retook his lands in Kakheti. Again, the eastern Kartvelians were not easily swayed into the kingdom of Georgia. The coalition grew further, with King David of Lori, the father of Gagik of Hereti, who also aligned himself with Liptaret. Demetrius and the Duke made a ferocious combination. Having someone as famous as Liptaret in your corner garnered more support away from Bagrat. The gains were slow, however, and could not outrace Demetrius. The would-be usurper died in 1042. His cause of death remains a mystery. Bagrat had lost an enemy and a brother, but this only served to strengthen Duke Liptaret more. The Byzantines did not pull out of Georgia, but switched their plan to giving their full support to the Duke. Now, one of Georgia's finest generals had the numbers to contend with Bagrat. Hope of maintaining his kingship waned in the balance and favored Duke Liptaret more every day. It was unlikely that Bagrat could defeat his much more experienced foe. And that's when a group of hulking strangers from a faraway land sailed up the Rioni River, parked their longships, brandished their axes, and offered their services to the desperate king of Georgia. Who was he to deny a Viking? The Vikings are widely considered to be the farthest-reaching medieval maritime group of Europeans. Their longships brought the Norsemen as far west as the North American continent. But what about the opposite direction? While they crossed the Atlantic, the Orient presented a different kind of expanse, one filled with nothing but grass and a maze of navigable rivers. The Leif Erikson of the East was a man named Ingvar. More fittingly, he was chronicled as Ingvar the Far-Traveled. Although his origins are steeped in legend, Ingvar was a Swede by birth, and likely part of that royal family. In the early 11th century, Ingvar would make his first expedition south and east, into the domains of his Rus neighbors. He offered his services to none other than Yaroslav the Wise, one of the most important unifiers for an early Russian state. By 1030, Ingvar's wanderlust had gotten the better of him. He sailed through the rivers until entering into the Black Sea. Here he passed by Georgia and made a way for their Bagratid cousins, the Kingdom of Armenia. It's unrecorded if Ingvar got up to any raiding on this expedition. It was more likely that this was a reconnaissance mission. The Caucasus region, in contrast to nearby Constantinople, was largely unexplored by the Vikings. With the exception of a handful of devastating raids a century earlier that delved into modern-day Iran and Azerbaijan via the Caspian Sea and its adjoining rivers. Ingvar made it all the way to the Armenian capital city of Ani, where his expedition would rest for some time. If it was not blood they wanted in this journey, then it was more likely than not a trading expedition. It wouldn't be long before Ingvar was called back north by Yaroslav the Wise, who was in the midst of fighting the growing steppe threat of the nomadic Pechenegs. While the Rus had utterly destroyed the Khazar Khaganate, the power gap was filled by numerous groups, some of the most terrifying among them being the swift Pecheneg cavalry. Ingvar fought for Yaroslav, and with his help, the Rus managed to hold the river highways and fight back the nomads. It would be some years after this that Ingvar the Far-Traveled would set off on his definitive adventure. In 1042, he once again sailed into the Black Sea. He had already met the Bagratid king of Armenia. Now it was time to meet his powerful, and more importantly to Ingvar, wealthier cousin in Georgia. 26 ships and 3,000 fighting men made their way towards a country they called Sarkland, translated to Land of the Saracens. By the time Ingvar arrived in Sarkland and docked his ship at the mouth of the Rioni River, King Bagrat of Georgia was in dire need of assistance. A civil war, funded by the Byzantines and under the sway of the disloyal Duke Liptaret, had consumed Georgia for nearly a decade. Where the Varangians usually served in the bodyguard of the Byzantine emperor, and even fought the Georgians on multiple occasions, Ingvar the Far-Traveled would offer his services to Byzantium's greatest rival in the Caucasus. A battle to decide the fate of Georgia grew closer with every advance Duke Liptaret made. Although Ingvar had brought 3,000 men with him on this excursion, Bagrat would hire 1,000 of the best of these Vikings. Now, Varangian axemen would fight alongside the mountain macemen of Georgia. What a terrifying and stout infantry combination this must have been. With Ingvar and his new mercenaries in tow, the young king of Georgia was eager to confront the former regent. Bagrat IV confidently marched into the rebel-occupied east of Georgia. The forces of Lord Liptaret and King Bagrat would meet at a riverside village called Sasareti, an army on either side of the fordable stream. The Vikings, perhaps confident with a body of water beside them, did not heed the advice of King Bagrat. Their position on the front line of the Georgian army made them all the more brazen. Without giving King Bagrat the slightest hint, the Varangians stormed across the river. They crashed into Byzantine auxiliaries and the opposing Georgian infantry. With his axe-wielding ace quickly revealed, King Bagrat could do one of two things: leave Ingvar and his Vikings to their death, or charge just behind the brave Northmen. Bagrat chose the latter option and ordered his army across the river. A brutal melee took place. The Varangian shock troops carved a hole through Liptaret's front line. However, they were largely suppressed by the time the main force arrived in support. Within a few moments, Bagrat's plans had gone from assured victory to terrible defeat. The king ordered a withdrawal and left the Varangians who had lost the fight for him. After the Battle of Sasareti came to its bloody conclusion, many prisoners were captured by Duke Liptaret. The rebel released all the Varangians he took hostage, including Ingvar, although relieving them of everything but the shirts on their backs. As for his fellow Georgians, Liptaret had them all tortured and even some blinded. The remaining Varangians, which would likely only be 100 or so men at this point, were forced to make the long journey back to their longships anchored all the way on the Black Sea coast. Ingvar and his Vikings made it across the foreign mountains and valleys of Georgia until reaching the capital of Kutaisi. Here they pleaded for Bagrat to offer much-needed supplies. He, however, refused, as the Varangians had not fulfilled their mercenary contract, as Bagrat had intended. The rest of the march to the coast would be one of half-dead men. Disease filled the ever-shrinking camp of Vikings. Many, including Ingvar himself, succumbed to it. By the time the Varangians reached the Black Sea, there were only a handful of them left. Where they had left with 3,000 men and 26 boats, only one longship would return from the disastrous Georgian expedition. The Battle of Sasareti symbolized the start of the end of the Viking expansion in the east. Although the Varangian Guard would continue to serve in Constantinople for many years, they wouldn't go far from MacLeod. To commemorate the fallen Vikings, 26 runestones were erected in Sweden, one for every longship they had taken with them to Sarkland. In the wake of the disastrous and very unique Battle of Sasareti, King Bagrat was left paralyzed. He had tried to break out of his Black Sea corner, but was pinned in by the Byzantines and Liptaret. Now all he could do was go onto the defensive fully, which is a viable enough strategy in itself, considering the mountains of his remaining lands. If there was ever a time for Byzantium to finally crush Georgia into full submission, then the time would be right now. But the Byzantines had other Bagratids to fry. The king of Georgia's Bagratuni cousins in Armenia were next on the chopping block. Although the Byzantines had been soundly defeated by the Armenians at the gates of Ani in 1042, the same year the Vikings were in Georgia, Eastern Rome was intent on bringing Armenia into the empire by any means necessary. In 1045, the king of Armenia, Gagic II, was eagerly on his way to Constantinople, hopeful to put the years of bad blood behind Byzantium and Armenia. A permanent peace was what he was promised. What he got was imprisonment and forceful abdication of his throne, thus setting up and continuing a long trend of Byzantines betraying Armenian rulers. When it was all said and done, the Bagratuni Kingdom of Armenia was no more. Bagrat had only to look south to see the future fate of Georgia. There was only one thing left to do. Bagrat agreed to peace talks with the Byzantine Emperor, Constantine IX. He, for quite obvious reasons, did not go to Constantinople to discuss an end to the war. The diplomats of Eastern Rome would instead sit at the negotiating table, right beside Duke Liptaret. The cost of peace was steep, but something that had to be stomached in its entirety. Bagrat would officially lose half of Georgia to Liptaret. Although he was still a duke, the Byzantines showered him with illustrious titles and made him the de jure ruler of Georgia. Bagrat would now largely answer to him, and by extension, the Byzantine emperor. One contemporaneous historian even goes as far as calling Liptaret the king of Georgia, and he might as well have been one. While Bagrat had survived his civil war, he was back to square one. His former regent was once again calling the shots on his behalf. His destiny as a mediocre king was all but assured. For 3 years this remained, when finally, a sliver of hope appeared in a more terrifying threat. The Seljuks, far from their ancestral grazing lands in Eurasia, were growing at an unprecedented rate. They had already conquered most of Iran and now shared a border with the Byzantine Empire. The Turks were not dismayed by this, but excited with a rich and overextended empire at their doorstep. Just as the Byzantines annexed Armenia, the Seljuks started plundering that same land. In 1045, a major Seljuk raiding party sacked Byzantine-controlled Vasparukan, the homeland of Bagrat's own mother. Here, the Seljuks would defeat and capture the local Byzantine governor, lending free rein to continue their destruction westward. A year later, in 1046, a different Seljuk host began a farther-reaching campaign. They left their own lands, allied some of the local Muslims, such as the Emir of Tbilisi, and plundered their way across eastern Georgia. As Georgia endured its first of many Seljuk raids, Duke Liptaret was helpless in the face of this new threat. All he could do was hunker down and wait for the Turks to depart. By the time they left, the Emirate of Tbilisi had broken their blockade and were given back the lands they held before the rise of the Georgians. While this invading army was successful in raiding the rich fields of Georgia, their luck wouldn't continue after their departure. The Seljuk army went south, again into Vasparukan. Here, 2 Byzantine commanders, Aaron and Katakalon, defeated the Seljuk force, taking with them the plunder they had acquired from Georgia. Emperor Constantine IX, with at least one victory under his belt, decided to press his advantage. To attack the oh-so-offensive Seljuk Turks would be a bold move, but one that could put a swift end to their hegemony over the east. Duke Liptaret and the 2 Byzantine generals to defeat the Seljuks, Aaron and Katakalon, gathered their forces together and prepared to make a stand. As expected, the Seljuks did not let up, and sent an even larger invasion force west, yet again into Vesperukin. After the Seljuks sacked a few towns and even took the fortress of Artsy, the Georgian Byzantine army arrayed themselves on the field in front of another fortress in the Seljuk path of destruction. All three commanders present on the Byzantine side could not agree on a strategy. Aaron wanted to take a defensive stand, Catacolone wanted to take the fight to the Turks, and Liptaret didn't know what to do. When Seljuk forward scouts appeared at the front of their massive army, the two Byzantine generals both agreed that an attack was necessary to defeat the Seljuk regiments one at a time, if they could. For whatever reason, Duke Liptaret saw the day as unlucky, and declined any invitation to attack. By the next day, Liptaret's mistake had become all to see. The massive Seljuk force outnumbered the coalition some 5 times over. On either flank of the army, the Byzantine generals took up their position. Forming the center lines was Duke Liptaret and his heavy Georgian infantry. They waited nearly all day, until finally making their move. It was almost dusk when the armies of Georgia and Byzantium started to march against their foe. The opposing armies would fight throughout the entirety of the night. Exhausted men pushed back the Seljuk horde until dawn broke. The two Byzantine generals on either flank decisively defeated their opponents. But as they began to regather, it became clear that the Georgians in the center didn't have the same luck. Although they were still mostly intact, the center line was missing one very important man, Duke Liptaret. In the chaos of the fight at night, the Seljuks managed to capture him and take the de facto king of Georgia back with them to Iran. With Duke Liptaret hostage, King Bagrat finally caught a much-needed break. He managed to reclaim eastern Georgia from the Duke without much fanfare. It appeared that the King of Georgia was ready to reassert his independence. And that's when Duke Liptaret returned to Georgia from his short stint as a Seljuk hostage. Emperor Constantine IX needed to keep Georgia as a Byzantine puppet, so he paid a heavy ransom for the release of Liptaret. When the Duke returned to Georgia, he was more ruthless than ever. Seeing that Bagrat had taken his half of Georgia, Liptaret was determined to make him pay for it with the other half. From 1049 to 1050, the Georgian Civil War reached its bloody climax. Duke Liptaret, with Byzantine aid, conquered all of Georgia, including the capital of Kutaisi. King Bagrat was forced to flee his own kingdom and seek aid from the source of destruction itself, the Byzantine Empire. Bagrat would go back to the city, where he was kept hostage from the ages of 3 to 6. His return was welcomed by the Byzantine Emperor. Finally, after some 20 years, he was once again a hostage in Constantinople. With Bagrat gone, Duke Liptaret ruled the entirety of Georgia on his own word alone. Without Byzantine supervision, he appointed Bagrat's young son, George II, as the new king of Georgia. And just like that, Duke Liptaret had recycled the regency. The Duke effectively ruled over a peaceful Georgia for 3 years. Despite his loyalties to only himself, Liptaret was perhaps a better ruler than Bagrat in this time. After all, he had much more experience in this self-created role. While Georgia had been subdued in its entirety, it was once again strengthening under the Duke, and that was just not okay with Byzantine foreign policy, who at this time was more focused on dividing and weakening its eastern neighbors than dealing with the true threat of the Seljuks. In 1053, Emperor Constantine IX released Bagrat from Constantinople and sent him back to Georgia. Now, With the tables turned and Byzantium in support of Bagrat, Duke Liptarit had lost his biggest sponsor. He made for a fighting retreat into eastern Georgia. Bagrat slowly reconquered his realm, regaining the favor of his nobles and dethroning his infant son. He had all but won the multi-stage civil war, but Duke Liptarit would just not give up. For 8 long years, the Duke fought a guerrilla war across Georgia. In this time, his allies in Kakheti and Lori attempted to help him, but were also soundly defeated by King Bagrat. By 1061, the once powerful Duke had been reduced to nothing more than a common bandit. His own men would mutiny against him, capture him, and personally hand him over to their returned king. Bagrat did not execute or arrest him, as may be expected, but took pity on his former regent. He forced Liptarit to change his name and take vows as a monk. He would die shortly after this, ending the line of the regent dukes of Kakheti. After 2 disloyal family members and the same number of wrathful regents, King Bagrat, for the first time in his life, was ruling over Georgia in its entirety. It only took 34 years of regency and civil war to get there. And just when everything was falling into place, the Seljuk threat reared its head towards the rich vineyards of Georgia. After winning his own, much shorter civil war, the notorious Alp Arslan became the Sultan of the Seljuk Empire. He almost immediately set his eyes on expansion into the Caucasus and the Middle East as a whole. In the following year of 1064, Alp Arslan started his campaign west. He ravaged through Armenia and utterly destroyed the city of Ani beyond repair. Going north, the Seljuk Sultan raided deep into Georgia. The land south of the Kura River became nothing more than a wasteland. The occupied fields would fall under the domain of the growing Seljuk ally of Tbilisi. King Bagrat could not face Alp Arslan alone. Instead of subjugating his country to the Seljuk horde, he once again paid for peace. Bagrat would marry his own niece to Alp Arslan. Not only this, but the Christian king of Georgia would be forced to pay the jizya tax as a tribute for keeping the horde at bay. Although Bagrat would pay the tax in full in 1064, the following year he would not, seeking closer ties with the only local power that could help him. Bagrat managed to secure what was perhaps the most prestigious marriage alliance at this time. His daughter, Maria, would marry the Byzantine Emperor, Michael VIII Dukas. Once great enemies, were forced into friendship with Alp Arslan at their doorstep. Empress Maria would become an influential character in the Byzantine court, marrying 2 separate emperors in a row. She was always willing to press for much-needed aid for her Georgian homeland. Meanwhile, a storm of hatred was coalescing around Georgia. The enemies that Bagrat had made during his event-filled reign were aligning themselves with the Seljuk Empire. On top of the Emirate of Tbilisi, Alp Arslan managed to turn Bagrat's Bagratuni cousins against him in Lori and Kakheti Hereti. A 4th member of the anti-Georgian coalition was found in the Kurdish nation of Aran. Now, with the Caucasus world against him, Bagrat had to contend with a massive invasion force. The Georgians largely gave up defending their already pillaged and plundered eastern lands. The Seljuks and their alliance got as far west as Kartli, which they occupied and raided before handing over all their gains to the Emir of Aran, who would act as the warden of Georgia and Armenia, as well as the defender of Tbilisi. Alp Arslan left nearly as soon as he came, entrusting the Kurdish emir with his new gains. What followed would finally be King Bagrat's shining moment. Bagrat previously had plenty of time to sit in fear and do near nothing. Now, with much more experience, he sought the reclamation of his realm by force. The Georgian counterattack could not be stemmed without the armies of Alp Arslan. First, they retook Kartli, and then made way for Tbilisi. The Emir of Aran met him just outside the city, where Bagrat would soundly defeat him. The Emir of Tbilisi changed tunes quickly, and recognized Bagrat as his liege lord. In this, Bagrat had gained a vital buffer state against the Seljuk Empire. With the Emir of Aran in flight, he made way to Kakheti Hereti, who was now a mutual ally through the Seljuks. The new Bagratuni king of these lands, Ag Sartan, had the Kurdish emir arrested and sent to Bagrat, in exchange for a few key forts on the Georgian border. With a swing in alliance, King Bagrat completely reversed his fortunes. The Seljuks were still quite obviously a giant threat, but now they would have an even greater challenge conquering Georgia. By the time King Bagrat emerged triumphant, Alp Arslan started his grand invasion of the Byzantine Empire. He would campaign for 3 years, before coming face to face with Emperor Romanus IV. At the following Battle of Manzikert, in which Georgian soldiers were present, the Byzantines would be soundly defeated by the Turks, who managed to capture the emperor himself. Just like that, Bagrat was deprived of his greatest ally. The Byzantines began a swift withdrawal from their eastern provinces, letting the Seljuks have free reign over that land. It was soon after this disastrous battle that King Bagrat IV of Georgia passed away at the age of only 54. For 45 years, Bagrat was the king of Georgia, even if he only had full control of his kingdom for the last 10 of those years. In my eyes, Bagrat is a victim to his time and place in history. A child king is almost always doomed with disloyal nobles looking to take advantage. Although his reign was marked by decades of civil war and invasion, in the end, Bagrat redeemed himself and left Georgia in a better place than when he was born. He secured alliance with Byzantium through marriage, beat back 3 Seljuk invasions, gained a vassal through Tbilisi, and allied himself with Kakheti. Bagrat IV had strengthened Georgia, but its place on the map meant nothing, especially with the Seljuks at the gates. If you'd like to support this stoic historian, feel free to do so on Patreon for as little as $1 a month, and join Derek Clark, Savak Leo Nazarian, Taj Guilford, Nickmate Voician, Lazarus Dykos, Dave J, and Dalinar. Or become a YouTube channel member, like Derek Clark again, Donald Vincent, and what? Why? Thank you guys again for supporting the channel. I really appreciate it.